Roberta has affectionately called me the Phoenician, and I'm happy to work for Howard and Roberta Amundsen at Fieldstead & Company as their Assistant Director of Research. Welcome to the panel, The Religious Potential of Beauty. When John Henry, with all of his intelligent design, helped to create this panel and bring these panelists together, he was very much interested in thinking about how beauty can have a powerful religious effect even when it is not linked to a sacred or explicitly religious theme. And so we might, as we've been doing through much of our time together, think about how beauty can convey the world of God with rare, immediate, and emotional power. Hildebrand's Beauty of the Second Power, of course, comes to mind here, and his remarks, I believe it's in chapter 9 of the Aesthetics, and he talks about how God has entrusted a kind of quasi-sacramental power to material reality, is one way we could think about that. We have a variety of panelists with a variety of different backgrounds, theologically and practically. I think we're in for a real treat. I will briefly introduce them and then have them make a brief presentation, and then we'll enter into some discussion. On my far right, your far left, we have Cameron Anderson. He is an artist, writer, and the executive director of the organization Christians in the Visual Arts. You can learn more about their work by going to CIVA, that's CIVA.org. Next, we have Jessica Ewell, Dr. Jessica Ewell, who is a songstress, storyteller, and voice track director of the Sacred Music program here at the university. And by the way, she'll be performing tonight, so we're in for a real treat. Her stage name is Jessica Victoria, and you can learn more about her work at jessicavictoria.com. Next, we have Joel Pelsue. He is the co-founder and president of Arts and Entertainment Ministries, as well as the Arts and Entertainment Institute in Los Angeles, and you can learn more about their work at a-e-m.org. And then next, we have Ken Wu. He is an artist and art professor at Berkeley College, the New York City campus. Yep, New York City campus, with training also in Italy at the Florence Academy of Art, along with further training at Oxford and in Beijing. And you can learn more about his work by going to kenwooart.com. W-O-O or W-U? W-O-O. Yep, very good, Howard. And then Dony Mac Manus is founder and developer of the Sacred Art School and Studio. You can learn more about his work at DonyMacManusStudios.com. Cam.
We are invited to make these presentations, and if we wanted to do PowerPoint, to send them on ahead before the event. So that's an interesting kind of experiment, right? Since I've never been to this event before and I wasn't sure what we were going to talk about. So 3 notes from the field, from me. My faith background is evangelical Protestantism, so I'm going to say a couple things about that background and eventually show you my most recent painting project. So the first note from the field, I want to say something about beautiful Savior. In the room, you're probably hearing a fact that evangelical Protestantism and Protestants, we really don't have really an aesthetic at all, really associated with our tradition. At least that's the sort of common thought. But in fact, we do talk about beauty inside the evangelical tradition, and in particular, having to do with the person of Christ. Now, the picture, that you might have all kinds of reactions to this painting done by Warner Sallman, the head of Christ, in 1940. Anderson University in Indiana has a complete collection of all his work. I just want to put this forward as really being what I consider to be the Protestant icon of the 20th century, or Jesus' yearbook photo, maybe. And there's dynamic equivalence in the Catholic world and all the traditions, images and pictures of Jesus. But in terms of talking about beauty in the evangelical community, it has mostly shown up in our hymnody and in our spiritual choruses. And it's been mostly focused on the person of Christ, his character, his sacrifice, his example to all of us, and relates directly to ideas about discipleship. And you can read the words here. So this great affection for the person of Jesus. Beautiful Savior, Lord of the nations, Son of God, Son of man, glory, honor, praise, adoration now and forever be thine. So in the language of the hymns, beauty comes up a lot in our tradition and in contemporary choruses. Lord, you're more precious than silver. Lord, you are more costly than gold. Lord, you are more beautiful than diamonds. Nothing I desire compares to you. So there is talk of beauty in the tradition. But can you tell that the word beauty is kind of grayed out there and kind of diminished? Okay, that was the point of the graphic here. But in our tradition, so there's a lot of talk about, in terms of the transcendentals, a lot of talk about truth. Both proving biblical truth, apologetics in relation to evangelism and witness in the world. And if you would measure books on bookshelves by the inch or the foot, these would be big, long shelves talking about truth. And then there's talk about goodness, especially personal piety, but in the last decades, social justice as well. A lot of talk, a lot of writing, a lot of conversation about goodness. But there's almost no conversation about beauty whatsoever, other than what I just sort of mentioned to you. There's extreme nervousness about material culture, and we just don't have the tradition that you Catholics do, and we're grateful for your tradition. In practical terms, in church life, it shows up like this. Preaching the word is given the priority. Musical worship increasingly is important in all kinds of different expressions, but sacred space is really not a topic of conversation at all. Up until a couple years ago, my wife and I were members of what had become a very, very large church, a Protestant megachurch, excellent in many, many ways. And the senior pastor and staff had me come in and look at the church model before they were about to build it. $40 million project, and kind of showing me carpet samples and paint chips and all the rest, and then the worship space. A well-designed building, but I said, guys, as you've been thinking about this, and especially the worship spaces in this church, have you thought about the creation of sacred space at all? And they all looked at me like, well, no. But not even with a sense that, oh, we should have really thought of that, but no, like we just haven't thought about that at all. And I said, well, how is the worship space that we're going to be meeting in on Sunday morning different than any kind of community meeting space that has excellent sound and lights and all, and seating and everything else for the arts? And they said, well, it's not going to be different at all. So I think that says something about the evangelical tradition. And this is a church with a wonderful mission and all kinds of wonderful things. But just beauty, especially in material forms, not thought about. Okay, so I wrote a book about this, just published in 2016, The Faithful Artist, A Vision for Evangelicalism in the Arts. I have a BFA, MFA in painting and drawing from secular institutions, so I've wrestled with my tradition my whole life, and that's what this book is about. Second note from the field, the modernist aesthetic. I want to be very brief here, but it's really true that the modernist aesthetic and modernism really did savage truth, goodness, and beauty. There's no question about that. But you could end up with a wrong conclusion. You could end up thinking that concerns about beauty and about spiritual life and transcendence really weren't present within that tradition. And by the way, the modern art movement is now part of the artist canon. It's an entirely different thing than the contemporary art movement today. Modernism is in the history books right now, and the important works of that period are still, of course, being debated and their meaning discussed, but it's really, part of the history now. It's not contemporary. So you have a painter like Mark Rothko, orange, red, and red. Rothko says this: I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. And the fact that a lot of people break down and cry when confronted with my pictures shows that I can communicate these basic human emotions. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. It would be entirely wrong to think that themes of transcendence and spirituality were absent from the modern art period. They were just present all along. What was also present, though, is hostility to religious belief, and especially to Christian belief, and especially to personal Christian devotion. But thoughts about transcendence and even beauty were present all along. I think an amazing piece here by Barnett Newman, Broken Obelisk, the place where the infinite and the finite meet, the material, the spiritual. I mean, you can't help but see the spiritual longing and religious affection that's present in a piece like this. So it's part of the modern canon. And here's a work by a member of our organization, Guy Chase, passed away a few years ago, but a small, really devotional piece, 9,000 dots, each dot representing his prayer practice coming out of his devotional life. Another picture of the monolith, really in the modernist tradition, but coming out of his own prayer practice. I think a beautiful piece. You can read this, but James Elkins really pretty much states the truth about things, that there's this great chasm between religious belief, and we'd say our Christian faith these days, and what's happening in the contemporary art world. Elkins is a friend of a lot of mutual friends of mine. He's very much in the conversation, great guy. But I think he's basically telling the truth here. We could unpack this later, but I know I'm running out of time. So, approaching the mystery. So what do you do if you're an artist from an evangelical tradition with a great appreciation for modernism, personal follower of God, and you want to make art? So I think about mystery a lot. And my materials are kind of raw materials from the steel yard and the hardware store, and I work in abstract kind of form with the plastics, meaning I'm interested in light, space, shape, form, texture, those kinds of things. I'm not a realist painter. So in 2014, I was invited to do a body of work, and I called it Approaching the Mystery. This is the sort of key to this series. It's called Approaching the Mystery, Red, Yellow, Blue. These pieces are Rust-Oleum paint and orange shellac lacquer on steel panels. These are 18 inches high by 24 inches wide. So that was the sort of key to the piece. And then much larger, the first panel, it was really a reflection on the Trinity. This is called Incarnate. This piece is big, 3 feet high by 15 feet wide, so big physical objects, much bigger than you're even seeing on the screen here. So that was, if it was Approaching the Mystery, red, yellow, blue, this is the red piece called Incarnate. That's the yellow piece called Gloria. Again, 15 feet wide, 3 feet high, on plate steel. And this is called Deep Blue. So the first piece was a reflection, second person in the Trinity, Christ incarnate, God the Father, Gloria, Deep Blue. So I have one more slide to show you, and then I'll be done. I did this body of work in 2014. In 2015, I had the privilege of being in Italy in a little town, Orvieto, for 10 days. We worshiped with a Catholic worshiping community there on Sundays, a congregation that has been worshiping continuously for 1,200 years. I was sitting in worship. I don't know Italian, but trying to sort of follow along, but feeling the real sense of God's presence in the space. And I looked off to my right. So this is 6 months after making the series Approaching the Mystery, Red, Yellow, Blue. And in the fresco on the wall was this fragment of the frame of a piece that had been there before for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I saw this piece and I thought, yeah, that's what I was trying to get after. That was the thing I was trying to paint that I hadn't seen before. This was 6 months later after having done this. Exactly in that order and in that sequence of time. I'll close with a quote that I use just about every time I speak. Madeleine L'Engle. To try to talk about art and about Christianity is for me one and the same thing. It means attempting to share the meaning of my life, what gives it for me, its tragedy and its glory. Thanks very much.
There's so much to say about art and God and beauty as the intersection between these two places. And I could have a really long conversation about sacred music, which is what I do a lot here, but that's a different conversation. I want to talk about the process that I encounter as a singer, as a songstress, and also how, as artists, we can bring God into, or bring others into the mystery of God, even when we're not talking about specifically sacred subjects. I'm fascinated by the incarnational aspects of beauty and of creation, and subcreation, as Tolkien would call it for us artists, because we get to show how God wants to flame out into every aspect of life, whether that be making bread or doing dishes or singing. I love, there's an example from a medieval cookbook that shows how to know when your cake is done. You would say a certain amount of paternosters, or you would mix the batter for a certain amount of Ave Marias. And so you would integrate this sacred part of life into the most basic of daily things. So that's what I try to do in my original music, and also in the classical sort of part of what I do. I like to try to dialogue with people through music that isn't perhaps sacred on the outside. My last project, Songs of the Summer Realm, was an album that looks at Arthurian themes, and more specifically Arthur as a servant leader, taking literary kinds of excerpts from these Arthurian stories and bringing them together with my original songs and some traditional arrangements of very old Celtic things. I wanted to be able to share this project with people who might not be Christian at all, but who have this longing for something beautiful, for something beyond them. And perhaps for them, the Arthurian story is the doorway. So that's an example of a project that tries to integrate or bring people into the encounter. I want to talk right now specifically about von Hildebrand's beauty of the second power, because for me this is really important in the way that I make music. Before I read chapters 6 and 9 of the Aesthetics, I thought about the artist as a window. It's our job to be transparent so that people can look through us, and I'm right now talking about musical artists and especially singers, and me. It's my job to open to the listener a world so that they can see through me, or even experience through me the fragrances, the sounds of the musical world that I'm trying to portray. And von Hildebrand's idea that beauty and audible beauty itself is kind of a pedestal is, I think, really central to what I do as a musician. Because you have these ingredients. It's kind of like baking again. I get back to food, yeah? So you have flour, and you have milk, and you have eggs, and you don't really understand how, at the end of this whole process, they come up with this amazing light cake. But they do. And as artists, in some ways, we do the same thing. We combine these very simple things. We open ourselves up after loads and loads of disciplined preparation, which I'm going to talk about next. And then we let God do his thing. We let something bigger than us happen for people so that they can encounter that beauty. Another thing that really resonated with my art practice is the observations that Dr. Schindler made today about von Balthasar's simultaneity of the three things going on in beauty, in encountering beauty. And I want to talk about each of those in the context of musical performance. So the first one, as he would have called it, maybe the tree-ness, the selfness of the tree, the realizing of the object itself. I think about in terms of Gerard Manley Hopkins's idea of heikeitas, the thisness of the music, the thisness of the performance. And for me, that means the actual notes on the page. It means the composer's perhaps biographical circumstances, the actual identity of the musical piece. That's really, really important. But I think a lot of the time, musicians get stuck there because there's so much. We want to communicate what's on the page, but so much more than that. The harmonic analysis, the themes, the transformations of the theme. And so that in itself is really important, but it's not the whole story. It has to be encountered with the other two aspects. The second one being the reality or the totality of creation in that moment, that realization that, oh my gosh, this is part of the glory of creation that I'm experiencing right now. For me, that translates into the organic experience of the moment, because each performance is different, because every circumstance brings with it its own strengths, its own sort of situation, its own audience, and all of the people who are listening are just as much part of the performance, because as I think it was Dr. Schindler and maybe Dr. Crosby also this morning mentioned, that beauty can be subjective and objective at the same time, in that we bring what we have to offer to that experience. So if I go to the most amazing Mahler concert in the world and I have a pounding migraine, I'm not going to get much out of it. Or if I go there not knowing anything about the tonal language that he's using, it'll sort of wash over me like a wave. So this is where listeners have a duty as well. If I wanted to appreciate and understand football, I would probably need to know the rules, yeah? Otherwise, I would just kind of sit there and wonder when it was going to be over. The thing is, you have to know the language and the rules about music as well in order to really understand and get to the next level. I'm not saying you can't appreciate it without really starting to learn the language, but I think by understanding the language, people can then step even further into that realization, that second part of spontaneity. And finally, I want to touch on the third aspect, which is the encounter with the mystery of God. And this is the one that we have the least control over, obviously. It's about being open to receiving whatever is being offered to us in the moment of that performance. And this is part of the joy for me of being an artist, because you do all your preparation, you do all your research, you do all your practice, everything, and then you bring it to those that you're going to share it with. And then God comes and he helps to make it his work. And it can be a sacred work, it can be a secular work that points to him. But that third aspect really sort of sets everything on fire in a really good way. And I think all of those are really important ways to think about art. Now, God doesn't follow these rules, obviously. I think about the movie Amadeus. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's one of the lessons that I got after watching that movie was God doesn't have to, he does his own thing. He can work through anyone. He can make, the most this humble instrument into something really beautiful and noble. And so I'm not saying that this is a formula that we should follow as artists, but I think it's a good way to think about what we do so that we can bring into the space of every day what is indeed sacred. And so these have been really important for me. I'm going to leave you with a very small quote that I have. I think sometimes not only by the process of artistic creation and sharing can we bring people into the encounter with God, but also within the work itself. There are some works that can capture for us this idea that beauty points beyond itself. This idea that it's not the end, but it helps us to hear echoes of home, as Dr. Crosby read from Newman's excerpt this morning. So this is an excerpt, my poor translation of the Portuguese, from a piece by Heitor Villa-Lobos, and this is a piece that I would encourage you to look up. It's the song of an 18th century poet. I dreamt of a night of festive and sorrowful moonlight, and we two stood on a path cold and naked with moonlight, the clouds running and seeking dreams, and with our illusions of fantasies, to live in heaven and to sing a sweet song that fills with light and love each life of our beautiful springtimes. And to me, that just really speaks of an aching longing to go beyond and find God.
Amen. Thank you, Jessica.
So I remember in seminary coming in, and my professor, Reggie Kitty, was teaching worship and theology and sacraments, and he came in after the weekend and he said, I had one of the most spectacular religious, worshipful experiences I have had in the last year over the weekend. Being all seminary students, we assumed maybe that was worship on Sunday, but he had been to a U2 concert. And I presume, if we're honest, there might be a few more in the room that have had that experience, whether it's U2 or some other orchestration or something, where that touched your soul more than what happened on Sunday morning, sadly. And it's been true for me, many concerts. Seeing Miles Davis live, as a young kid, seeing Preservation Hall, and this quartet, it takes you somewhere else. And I was reminded when I was studying jazz in college, as a very avant-garde jazz professor, John Rapson, and my wife was doing theater productions, and she gave me this book by Peter Brooks called The Empty Space. If you're in theater, you've heard of it. Very cutting-edge director, the cutting-edge director of the 60s and 70s on Broadway. And what blew me away is he talked about artwork, and thank you, Jessica, I think the whole nature of artwork being a dialogue between the artist and the audience, which you see more in music and performance than visual art, though it's still there, but it's more live for performing artists. And he talked about when you block a show on Broadway, that you block it for that exact time in history. So the opening night, it is precisely blocked, meaning you're going to walk exactly to this point, you take off this color jacket at this point, you say this phrase that we all use in colloquialism at this time. All of this is blocked for one moment. And each day after that, it begins to decay. So if you're doing the exact same show a year from now, it is not as alive as the day you created it. And I remember sitting in the orchestra pit with my friend Dale Stuckenbrook on Broadway at Jekyll and Hyde, and it was the 100th performance. And the musicians in between pieces, they're reading comic novels and everything else because they played it 100 times. And the challenge is how do you keep it fresh? And one of Peter Brook's point was, that I think carries over, he said, if we don't understand this, we create deadly theater. And what he meant, he described how we do this to children, and this fit my experience, is often children, we take them to Shakespeare productions, which are not top level quality. And so they go, and the actors may not really understand the words that well, they don't get the iambic pentameter, the rhythm, everything else. And so they do their best, and yet they're not really good at communicating this medium. And so you grow up thinking Shakespeare is supposed to be difficult to understand. It's supposed to be a bit obscure, and to be cultured is to be a little bit just agreeing we all like this, but it's just difficult. And he said, this is deadly theater. You're not really fully understanding the medium, fully in the moment, fully connecting with your audience. This is deadly theater. And I was reading the book, and my wife and I were dating at the time, and I looked up and I said, we do this in church. We do deadly church. Because we create a form, and then it's so safe and easy we just stick with the form. And we almost make an idol out of the form. It needs to be exactly this way every time. But it begins to decay until it's codified and it's in a coffin. David kept saying, I need to sing a new song unto the Lord. Not the same old song, the same old way every time. And if you're an artist, I know you understand this. You've got to do it a new way. And for me, it was jazz. And it is jazz. And being at the conference, I apologize. I wish I would have just brought my saxophone and just played for you. But maybe another time. And Jessica and I talked about maybe we'll do some jazz standards in the beer garden another time, which would be great. But the most transcendent experience, one of them in my life, was a dear friend of mine, Randy Oliver, phenomenal pianist. And I didn't even realize until he died. I was 33 at the time. He was 30. And first time someone your age dies, it hits you severely. A close friend, dear brother. I didn't even know. He had played in films at age 13 on the organ. And he was a bright mind, debating issues with John Frame and some of the great minds in our tradition. And so I went to this church. I was working in Long Island, pastoring, and he was from Brooklyn. So I go to this church, and I'm one of 10 white people. And it is all African American, which is Randy's heritage. And I go in, and they had, if you were a minister, you got to go up front and talk and share your experience. Quite a few from Westminster Seminary, and all these other guys came, and they had said wonderfully profound things, but I had brought my saxophone. I'll get emotional. I got up and I said, I could share something, but really what I shared with Randy is not something I said. So I picked up my tenor sax and I just started playing Amazing Grace. And slowly, and I took all the time for the arpeggios and the glosses, and it just, all the emotion as an artist rushes through you at that point. And I'm lost. And it's that moment as an artist that you're so in the moment, as you said beautifully, it's this dialogue. It's different every time. But you're so lost in the moment, it's like a taste of heaven. Everything freezes. It's like the blues, that one note that just keeps the tension. It's a foretaste of heaven. And I have my eyes closed, and all of a sudden, this one guy walked from behind me, gets on the organ. Another guy came up, get on the drums, and then the whole church stood up and we just started singing. And I'm thinking, I don't know, I can't stop this thing, And we just kept going, and it was unplanned, but in that moment, you disappear. And I grew up, my dad was a worship leader at a church it was a mega church in the time, and sometimes he'd lead worship, and then in the middle of the song, he'd just get off stage because it's not about him. You're supposed to be lost in worship. And so for me, those are those experiences where, as an artist, you want to be completely lost in the dialogue and in the actual interaction with the audience. And I'll describe this. So for me, a religious experience of beauty is this. It is to be fully present in the moment, fully available to the moment, and fully engaged. So it is that engaging the object and being available to the object that we're talking about. And in that moment, you experience a foretaste of heaven. For a moment, you see the grandeur of creation, of color, of texture, of sound, of being, of existence. As if you were standing by the edge of the Grand Canyon, not knowing it, and someone turned your face to what was behind you. And in that moment, we are undone, surprised by beauty. And in that same moment, if we follow that aroma to its source, we may see through a veil the face, the love, and the beauty of God. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful event and actually letting me share a little bit about my work. I'm actually a traditionally trained artist. I wouldn't say classically trained, but as traditional as you can get at this time of our at this time. I'm actually a convert from the Buddhist tradition, and so meditation and prayer has been extremely important for me. And for my art. I feel that art for me is a vehicle to transcend the viewer to the divine realm. And I started studying iconography a little bit prior to this project. I wrote for Our Savior's Church here, and it was the perfect vehicle for me to meditate through the art and actually almost transcend through the icons to a divine world. It gave me a sense of calmness, sense of hope, right? So Providence has it that before I started working on this church, I used to go there every afternoon to pray. The church is actually, it was built in 1950, and they went over budget, and so they never finished the decorative elements. It was, I'll show you this. This is on 38th and Park in Manhattan, right down the street from Grand Central. So I used to go there all the time to pray, and it was built in a Byzantine style architecture. So it was kind of a square, elongated square, and it never had really too much windows or stained glass, a few here and there. So it had this aura of this dark, quiet place that it was amazing, because you could just sit there and pray in silence, one-on-one to God. So Providence has it. I was going through my conversion at the time, and went to RCIA, and the pastor at the time was looking for something to be done on the altar in the sanctuary. So submitted a proposal for the Pantocrator, and I guess he liked it, so we started, right? Here's another, sorry. So here's overall scope of the project. The first stage I did with a really good friend, Donald Murray from Ireland too. We went to school together. We actually all three of us went to school together in New York. And so the first stage was the big Pantocrator, and some of the front saints, okay, more of the Byzantine saints in the front. My wife also, I went to school with her, and she also was involved with the work. So it's a group effort, and I think cathedral painting or church painting is meant to be not a solo project. It's meant to have a workshop and everyone working together, okay, at this, because that's where all the fun comes through, right? And then the second phase, we decided to do some smaller saints in the back, representing. This is Saint Chrysostom, the preacher of saints. All right, just a detail of one of the saints. All right, so the second phase, we decided to do some saints from around the world, since this church was next to the UN. So we brought in saints from China, saints from Africa, okay, and because it was such international traffic through the church there. All right, and here's another picture of after the Mass, and it was they had the Latin Mass there, and it really the liturgy and the paintings or the icons and the architecture went perfectly together. And that's, I think, the most important thing, is to really work and incorporate all three together, or else if it's all mishmash, then it really doesn't work for prayer. right? And unfortunately, as some of you might know, the paintings were taken down, all right, from the next pastor, unfortunately. And this is what it looks like. No clear reason, but it's just, I think the taste, he said taste was an issue. So anyways, I mean, I'm not trying to show this because it's like just to promote this or anything, but I just wanted to, not have you guys shocked when you walk into the church and see a half-empty church, right? So that's what it looks like now, unfortunately. But through this process, right? Through this process, I learned tremendously. I'm a new convert, so I grew as a Catholic, and kept on going, and this is Damiano Cross, a version of it. So, I mean, obviously you can see that I take a lot of the canons of traditional iconography or traditional imagery, but I try to put on little tidbits of my own style to it. You don't want to deviate too much, but, I really enjoy the 7th century, the very... back in, the almost Romanesque art. So I try to incorporate a lot of that. And I really enjoyed that time period because the artists were anonymous, per se, and it was, I think, nowadays, I mean, I'm not trying to say anything bad about the Renaissance or anything, but, the superstar artist came about, and it was just solely about the artist itself, it was a power play. But so on my icons for the public works, I try to keep it anonymous and try to go back to the tradition. All right, yeah. So here's a piece I did for the sisters. It's now in Calcutta. Obviously, I never met her, so I had to work from imagery. And that's about it. And I do secular stuff too, and portraits. But we're speaking again on Friday, so I'll just kind of bring you through some of my other work on Friday. All right, thank you.
Just after September 11, we were studying together, myself and Ken. And just after September 11 in New York, things were pretty hectic. And a number of very, very horrific things happened, which had major scars on me. And I went to Florence, or to Rome straight after that, to work on a commission to do a sculpture for St. Peter's. I was shortlisted to do a statue for St. Peter's Basilica, one of those 5-meter ones. But I didn't get it. But while I was doing that, I decided to draw the Pietà, and I did 3 drawings of the Pietà from 3 different angles. And this was something I just did instinctively, but it actually healed me. It healed my faith in humanity, my faith in God, and my faith in my vocation as an artist, because I realized that through drawing this, through contemplating this masterpiece, I realized that art has the power to heal. And what I'd gone through the months before this were so horrific that I was completely healed within these 3 weeks. And I realized from that this artwork has that power, and so many people pass through St. Peter's Basilica, and tourists just passing this may be converted. I'm sure many people have been converted just by this piece alone. And I felt that if I could just get a little bit of this in my work, I could try and heal through my own work. So that gave me a mission. So the way I approached that was to take what I learned in the New York Academy of Art. I had to actually, as a European, go to the United States to learn about European art. So I want to thank you guys for that. So while I was back in Europe, I decided to use it to really analyze it. So what I did is I took anatomy and I tried to simplify anatomy by breaking down the muscle structure into 5 different colors. Red and green as extension, and red as flexion. A bit of Monty Python. So you have that extension, flexion, complementary colors, complementary action. Then orange as abduction, and blue as abduction, blue, and adduction, orange, and yellow as rotation. So basically you can break down the anatomy of the human body into 5 different movements. And this is extremely helpful for an artist. When they see a body, they know what muscles are in actions, which muscles are in tension, and which muscles are relaxing. So it's actually a really easy way to develop a grammar in anatomy. And I use this. This was all instinctive. I didn't know what I was doing. I just did it because I felt I needed to understand this. I decided to use this scientific reductionist approach to art to study the great masters. So for instance, I did these drawings, these are life-size drawings of skeletons, and then I superimposed these transparencies on top and imposed this muscle structure. And then I decided to use that analysis to study this drawing on the right, which is an enlargement of a Pontormo drawing, which is for a mosaic, or for a fresco in Florence. And it's the angel Gabriel in the action of the Annunciation. So the most sublime moment in history, when God becomes man. And I decided to analyze this particular depiction because Pontormo has this tremendous mysticism in his work, but it's also carnal. There's very solid bones and very solid muscles, but they're elevated and animated in a supremely spiritual way. So I knew that this would be the ideal image to analyze. So I enlarged the drawing to 2 meters, that's 6-7 foot. And then I got a transparency and put it on top of the drawing and pulled out the skeleton, so as to see this primary layer of grammar, to see the movement of the forms, because bones don't change shape. So by analyzing the bone structure, you see the movement of the form. So you see that the actual figure is dancing. Its legs are going across and arms going across. So you know that this is a dancing movement. And the chest is actually twice life size. So he's inhaling the Holy Spirit. There's this inhalation. So everything in the bone structure is communicating a dance and a breathing. And actually the chest is the source of life in sculpture, if you look at the Belvedere torso. So the next thing I did was to put another transparency on top of the skeleton one, on top of the drawing, to pull out the muscle structure. And by abstracting that muscle structure, I realized that he was severely tapering these forms. So the upper arm is actually much wider than the wrist, and this communicates Pontormo's mannerist abstraction to communicate grace and movement in the form. And also you can see the abstractions of the forms and which muscles are in tension, which muscles are relaxing, so you can see this dance movement. And then I put another transparency on top of those 2 other ones to pull out the drapery. So the drapery, quite obviously, is not just dripping drapery like what I'm wearing here, just with gravity, but it's billowing drapery, which is communicating the external environment of the Holy Spirit, the wind of the Holy Spirit. So by analyzing this really shocked me. Actually, it's kind of appropriate because I did this. This is actually done in Beato Angelico's studio. I was given his studio by the Dominicans of San Marco in Florence. They gave me this studio. It's on the left of the church, opposite side to the museum. So next time you're there, you'll see this studio was given to me for 2 years. And I discovered this. I think it was a grace. I think it was Beato Angelico passing on a very secret message, because this helped me understand what goes on in great sacred art. So I was just told, I didn't know what I was doing, but I discovered it as I was doing it. This is a revelation, because by doing this, I explained it to my students. I put all the layers on top of each other, and you start to see how a great master sees in order to communicate deep spirituality. So the bone structure is expressing spirituality, the muscle structure, and drapery. And through that demonstration, you'll see these are other Puntormo drawings. You see how he uses anatomy and how he poetically abstracts from the beauty of the human body to create these poetic drawings. So drawings are not just scientific analysis, but they're actually poetic abstractions of the beauty of the human person. And here, I'm doing it in 3 dimensions with my students in Beato Angelico Studio. So this is where these students were students of the other schools, and they felt that they weren't getting what they needed. So they asked me, these are faculty and students from the other schools in Florence. They asked me to start a class like this so as they could understand. Because they were learning everything about the human body except what it means. Everything they knew of the techniques, but nothing about the meaning. And I was helping to extract the meaning from the body in anatomy. This guy in the middle here with the hat, that's Osamu. Now, I point him out because when he was baptized in the Duomo in Florence, just as we were exiting, I asked him, Osamu, what was it that converted you? And he said, it was that 5-minute demonstration I've just shown you. That he realized that if he was to create poetic, mystic images, he has to become a Catholic. He has to absorb this. So it just gives you an idea of the power of this. This is a bust I did of Saint Escriva. It's in the headquarters of Opus Dei in the United States in New York. And this is based on a Bernini. So the last images were based on Michelangelo, but this is based on Bernini. And this gives you an idea how anatomy can be used in perspectival space. So with this image, you see that the statue of Saint Escriva is set into the wall so as not to compete with the tabernacle. But when you look at Saint Escriva, you don't only see the image of the saint, but you're also guided towards the tabernacle. So it's that triangulation, this Baroque triangulation, which even goes further, not just interior language of the body, but also that body within a theatrical space. And I think we need to reclaim this incredible vocabulary because our churches desperately need this. So, and that's Cody and Alina there. So this is Cody being baptized, and Cody and Alina, they were the first to be baptized. And then the next year, Osamu, the Japanese guy, was baptized with Cody's father and their child. So these are all coming through this revelation through art of the beauty of God. And this continued on to 12 conversions. But I don't have time to go through all that. But that's where I'm coming from.